Hey, over to Dr. McKenzie.
Thank you. And can I just say thank you to the previous speakers? Excellent presentations, big shoes to follow up with. And hopefully I can sort of tie a couple of these things together maybe from your presentations, just in the context of what's happening in Newcastle. And I want to talk, and I'll primarily talk about social housing. Well, what I'll do is I'll talk about social and affordable housing. Of course, these are talked about in the same breath now. It's one of the great sleight of hands of government over the last 20 years is to sort of talk about social housing and affordable housing in the same breath. Quite different, right? Affordable housing refers to the kinds of rent-controlled community housing provider managed houses that are set aside. Developers get significant concessions to build those on the condition that they're rent controlled for 10 years typically, and then they revert back to normal housing stock. Quite different from social housing, which is government owned and often managed by community housing providers as well, but is retained by government at fixed rates. Quite different again from what we might call actually affordable housing, which is housing that people are able to afford. In Newcastle, none of that is being built, right? Newcastle's in a sort of an unusual zone where we have the same impacts on our housing, construction costs as inner Sydney or Western Sydney, same sort of housing increases in construction index, but for significantly less return on investment, right? So if you are a developer looking to build, you have the option of building in Sydney or Western Sydney, where the value of your property ultimately will command much higher rates of return, or in Newcastle, which is why we are seeing, in terms of the Newcastle construction, only luxury apartments, right? Newcastle East, Newcastle West, along the high density corridors, we're only seeing luxury apartment blocks being built because that can command more in terms of the return to developers than you can if you're building student accommodation, boarding houses, mixed use, multi studios and so forth. But I want to, before I talk about the private market, and just in the interest of time, I just want to underscore, and this will relate quite strongly to what Professor Root had said earlier, current situation in Newcastle for social housing. There's 1,934 households on the waiting list for social housing and 138 households priority. That means we don't know where they're going to sleep tonight. 138 households priority looking for housing and for social housing. The average wait time in the region for priority is 4 months. So if you find yourself in a position where you are desperately needing social housing, you've got to find a way to meet that need for 4 months. If you're not on the priority list, the average wait time is 30 months, 2.5 years. The projected need for, well, currently we have an unmet need for social and affordable housing of about 10,700 units, right? The estimate projected needs by 2036 puts us up around 14,600 in terms of social and affordable, and that's not counting the recent population increases with the new New South Wales housing targets. But let's say around about 15,000 to be built by 2036. Currently in development or in design, 150. There might be a couple more than that. But as far as I know, from development application currently being constructed, there's 150 social and affordable houses being built. It's nowhere near. It's a paltry figure in terms of what's been anticipated by the need, which is again around about 15,000. Nowhere near it. Despite the, so there's been some generous moves. The New South Wales government obviously has made this a priority. They've given us some numbers, some targets. Oh, you better deliver this target. No infrastructure support, of course, no assistance in the way in which that might be delivered, but plenty of concessions to developers. So if you build affordable housing, that's the official affordable housing, you can get up to a 30% increase on your floor space and height of your building without needing separate approval for that. So very generous development concessions. For every 10 units that you build, you get another 3 on top of that windfall benefit from the rezoning that you were talking about, Jason. You would expect maybe that's produced a flood of
social housing, government provided housing, would be in places where people wanted to live. You know? So there's some near beaches. You know, we've got some at Bar Beach, Hamilton South. You know, nice sort of parts of the areas. Now those places have increased in value, so they're being looked at being sold off. And the idea is, well, we'll sell those ones off, but we'll build western suburbs ones. Much more bang for our buck if we build them out there. Places with no amenity. Car dependent. They're hotter in summer and colder in winter, so they cost more of your budget to actually live in. And just that level of entrapment in a poverty cycle that comes when you move social housing away from the provisions and services and amenities. In terms of the redevelopment, though, and this goes right to what Professor Root was saying earlier, that when a lot of the housing stock, social housing stock, was built in the 1950s, and it was built for a different target. At the time when that housing stock was being developed, the majority of people that were buying or having access to that social housing, wages was their predominant income. Right? The number of people who are waged and in social housing has fallen in that period to 7%. 93% of people in social housing are dependent on aged income, disability income, some combination of the two, or some other kind of government-supported income. Historically, it was there to provide a low-cost housing option for families to make that transition into home ownership. But the people who are there now are very unlikely to be making that transition. 70% in the 1970s, as recently as the 1970s, 70% of tenants were couples with children. Now that accounts for 4%. The people in social housing are much older. They're much less likely to be working or have a separate income, and they are much more likely to be living on their own. Some more figures that are interesting here. In 2001, half of the entrants into social housing had complex and intersecting needs around mental health, education support, employment support. That's up to 2/3 just in the last 20 years alone. And as was mentioned, social housing now is partially provided as one of a suite of social welfare provisions. So it's more likely to be bundled with wraparound services for the people in our society that are most vulnerable. Not to do with housing, it is to do with making sure there's a safety net for people who are otherwise not being catered to. 60% of tenants in social housing now live alone. I'll get to that in a moment. 30% are on the aged pension, 34% on the disability pension. In the 1970s, 1 in 3 of social housing, right now 1 in 3 are over 65 and 10% are over 80. The problem that we have is that the housing stock that currently exists in places like Newcastle was designed for families making that transition. So we've got an enormous quantity of 3 and 4 bedrooms, large yards, located sort of in not necessarily that close in. And now we have underutilisation right across the board, where people are looking for studios or 1 bedrooms, now in a situation where they've got enormous maintenance responsibilities, high levels of disability, high levels of need, often quite a bit older. What exists as our housing stock doesn't meet the change demand of what we're actually targeting. And remember, we're just targeting those priorities. One more fact that might be interesting to note is that roughly half of the social housing tenants that exist in New South Wales have been in social housing for 10 years or more. So not only are we not making that pathway to transition into home ownership, which is what it was historically intended to do, that low turnover rate means that even though there's more demand, we're not creating more opportunities for them. So it's this compounding set of complications on top of our social housing issues. This is quite sort of separate from ultimately the where we are in terms of the planning. And I probably will talk about this maybe if we leave some time for questions, but the attempt to address this has been to radically sort of alter the planning policy context through some very key measures. One is to sort of create these housing targets from the state government, which are often done, to be blunt about it, it's often done by Sussex Street planners, Macquarie Street planners that sort of do compasses on maps and say this area will increase its density by X, with very limited understanding. The train station example is the perfect one that shows just what has happened there. And the other is to not be providing that enabling infrastructure that makes it possible. So if you have these high housing targets, that's fine. But when people move into areas, if you're not providing new schools, new hospitals, new aged care facilities, new shopping districts, new employment lands, new police stations, new libraries, no community centres, parks, playgrounds, all open space, the kind of natural infrastructure that we're sort of barely clinging on to as we go, as we build onto our floodplains. This idea that if we build it, we just create a housing target and shoot for it, then all of these other things will naturally come into place. And there's no evidence historically that is what happens, particularly in an area like Newcastle with very limited greenfield development opportunities. Almost all of our new development is going to be infill or brownfield development, like Honeysuckle and Broad Meadow from the state perspective. There's a tiny bit, about 7% of our housing target will come in far western suburbs, but we're not expecting anything there other than, when you said before that when people say housing estate and people cringe, if that's what we're expecting in western suburbs, car-dependent cul-de-sacs and even widening, the Midway Road even further to try and accommodate it. So we've got this sort of quandary of issues, immediate pressing need, and the way that it's predominantly being responded to is to relax the planning controls. I always think, when you're in an emergency, you trust the plans that you did when you weren't in an emergency, right? You don't suddenly take that time to change the plans. And so the sudden increase to anywhere within 200 metres of a train station to 6 stories, it's worth having a look around the Newcastle train stations to see what the impact that would have on density and needs in those areas, or to create housing targets that are unrealistic and not matched to the provision of social infrastructure, is going to create enormous pressure on councils, on state governments, on the ability of communities to manage that massive increase in population without the same level of infrastructure spend. So I might just sort of, I don't have a solution. I'm just sort of throwing out the issues.
Thank you very much. I've learned something brilliant from each of the speakers, and my brain is very excited. Anyone want to say something? You said something before. What did you say?
I just think the state government is saying, let's build new railway stations. But what is the point if the railway station is not working half the time? And where are people going to go to? Do they know where people need to go? To Newcastle. Even the buses don't do it because they don't get from A to B.
Yeah.
You can't just start building and then hope for people will fit.
Yeah, we've got a problem here. And what each of these speakers has taught me is that we've got to put our brain into gear and not just say, we need to build more houses. Because as far as I'm concerned, the people with money are going to buy them. That's not going to solve people into houses. I mean, it's like we're trying to, someone in Sydney's just decided to, as you said, put a protractor around. So we're just going to build them around train stations. Fixed. But just send it out there and let everyone.
What works in Sydney does not work here.
No, but I don't think it works in Sydney either.
Can I respond to that directly?
Yeah, sure.
Is that all right? So that's exactly right. So the train system in Newcastle works very different. Literally no one gets on a train at Adamstown and goes, I'm going to go into town on the train.
It doesn't stop.
Well, that's right. So it functions in a completely different way. There's a lot of issues with this. One, like Katara is another classic issue, right? Yeah. On a map, Katara, we'll increase the density around Katara. Katara train station is a 25-minute walk to the shopping centre, right? If you look there, it's that's right.
In front of it as well.
It's all low density. It's all up on a hill. There's no demand for increased density around there. Where there is an increase, and building new train stations is a good idea as a general principle, right? Where we need it is Sandgate and Warrabrook, which really need that going ahead. But because it was a Sydney-based plan, they said, oh no, not those train stations because they're diesel trains. So what's that got to do with anything? And we're only looking at rebuilding around electric trains. So the places where we actually could have done with the rezoning, to actually push development, has just been arbitrarily left off because there was no understanding of what was actually happening in Newcastle. Much less the fact that they've sort of created this rule that would apply to Wickham interchange, which would have actually reduced the amount of yield that we have been able to create through 20 years of careful redevelopment in and around Wickham. So there's just no consideration at all of what is on the ground. Quite literally an arbitrary decision, which has resulted in, windfall benefits for people that own the houses in those locations, but very limited capacity for that to actually.
Where do you go?
Where do you go? How do you, what will attract people to move to these, 6-story, 7-story apartments in Katara? Like there's nothing there. It's just a classic case of that arbitrary planning.
Well, there is people do like to live in apartments these days. We don't just need houses, and you may not want to move into an apartment, but a lot of people do. And I believe an apartment that was advertised for retirees near Wickham was filled in a flash. With people wanting to get in. I'm just throwing that out. You can't just assume that people don't want to go into apartments. And the other thing I just want to raise, which was mentioned briefly, is the problem of who's going to build or whatever we decide on accommodation, whenever we decide where it's going to be, who is going to build it? How many builders have we got? How's the training going to build things? So just throwing those things.
Yeah, well, as Joe said at the beginning, we've just this hasn't been a problem, which is no one's done anything about. Planning used to be the hidden art, I've always imagined planning being like some kind of godly. At that point, they would be content sitting on the back porch having a schnapps, looking at their society of happy people just being able to do everything they needed. And that was their recompense. Now that we're in chaos, the hand of the planner is no longer there. I mean, yes.
Kerry's got her hand up too, so I think she's
Kerry.
got a question.
Did you hear us, Kerry?
Hi, yeah, I'm here. How are you? I've got a couple of comments on that. So like affordable housing, and this is for me personally, by the way. So I have a 19-year-old third-year apprentice daughter. Now, for her to buy a house, she's allowed to have a 5% deposit, but that's still at a $500,000 house, which basically, you're not going to get much for under that because I've looked for her. She needs $20,000. So, where is a third-year apprentice or a fourth-year apprentice going to get $20,000 from? So, for my thing, affordable housing is like if you're on an average wage in Newcastle, you should be able to afford to buy a dwelling. And for some reason, that doesn't seem to be affordable housing. And the other thing is, have we not learnt what happens when you build a Windale? And when you build a social housing suburb, like there's one in every town, we have one in my hometown of Tamworth, it's called Coaldale, and it's exactly the same thing. You put people from low socioeconomic backgrounds all in the one suburb, Mount Druitt, like we can point fingers at all of them. It doesn't work. All you do is create a ghetto. So we don't really want a ghetto. We need to spread it out a little bit more. And as for the trains, well, like I bought a house in Beresfield because I can catch the train to work, and that was a big tick on my list of things to do. But it's not much point being able to catch a train from Beresfield to town if it gets flooded at Sandgate every time there's a high tide and huge amount of rain. So the whole debate about the public transport, and I read about the Katara one, and they're right, but they built the train stations how many years ago? And nothing's grown exactly as they thought it was going to be. And moving a train station is a pretty big thing. Like the new Maitland Hospital, should they put a train station near it? But how much money is that to just build an extra train station? Like it's such a complex thing. But, I have one daughter who's going to move back to the Hunter Valley and she's not even sure they can afford to buy a house. And then I've got the second one who's an apprentice and, she's still living at home because she can't afford to move out yet. But it's a huge issue. That was my comments.
Thanks, Kerry.
Has anyone seen Rouse Hill Railway Station? In Sydney, Rouse Hill Railway Station. Rouse Hill Railway Station actually is elevated, and it's a bit like the Anzac Bridge, where actually the railway goes over the roadway. Mm-hmm. But there's housing there. There's a lot of little townhouses. There's a whole suburb of townhouses. So there's a population that will feed the railway, and we just don't seem well. They want to put the population near the railway, but the railway has to go somewhere that's useful.
Well, I just see railways infrastructure, the nervous system of the city. So, I mean, look, my limit is when I hear proposals like Jason, we see this every year with the architecture students and the studio work. They tackle these problems and they come out with these holistic plans that I'm not getting out of government at all. I'm not getting out of the people that we're actually paying our taxes for. And I see brilliant solutions, brilliant ideas that approach these problems without any of that sort of political ideological stuff that just makes sense to me, fixing up the flooding issue, because with all they say we shouldn't be building on a floodplain, but we've got pictures in the archives of Broadmeadow underwater. I mean, the whole Premier Hotel is a lake. The whole thing is a floodplain. But we fool ourselves, and this is where the Aboriginal landscape comes in. We fool ourselves into thinking that because we've put roads and bitumen, somehow we've protected ourselves, or a football oval. Now, our football ovals are on Aboriginal wetlands. Okay, so when we have a Pasha-Bulga flood, the landscape goes back to being an Aboriginal landscape, and we've got no understanding and no care for that. So resonating with what Jason was talking about, that sort of fixing up, that sort of allowing the water to do what it has to do, okay? The ancient Egyptians had a season just for the flood, inundation, because it said the Nile has to create this in order to give us arable lands which will feed us. But here we see a flood as a war. It's us versus the flood. So everything's at war. So if we can get our planning so that we're not at war with nature, the creatures aren't leaving us in droves, that would be wonderful from the way I'm looking at it. These three speakers to me have really unlocked it for me today, what we need to do. How we're going to do it, I don't know. Any questions from the Zoomers? Just
okay, I just wanted to make a comment about the lady whose friend got a 5% deposit, which is pretty good going, or her apprentice friend did. Yes, I have a friend that's been trying to get a house for 20 years, close to immigrant. She finally got 20 grand out of COVID yes, they can hear me. She finally got 20 grand out of COVID by taking out 10,000 twice from a super, and then it took her another year and a half, and she finally got on the 5% list. So she's actually living in a house after all that time. That, of course, has mixed blessings, because in the first few years of home ownership you're struggling, but she's learning.
Okay. But it's when we're talking about those solutions that Jason was saying, if we are going to build in a floodplain, then we've got to design houses that can float.
Volume's terrible.
Or come up with pretty, interesting solutions to meet what is ahead of us, all right? Because there are a number of things hitting us besides the sort of stupid ages that are just coming at it. But, I mean, those wonderful solutions, those holistic ways of approaching things, I just find very inspiring, And while Jason was speaking, I actually want to see something like that created. That would be something, the housing development, I would look forward to, because you could prove, and if you can keep Shane and Paul happy, I mean, these are the guys who have been so concerned with the heritage of the site. And this is what was coming through with the various heritage groups. We've had environmental heritage groups that were looking at the clear felling of their forests, or the one up at Maitland, which was, what was that? And that was the waterworks, Walker.
Walker Waterworks.
Luckily, that was called off, but that was another thing. Everything was kind of under siege with this. Like, we've got to solve this housing problem, which means we're going to plonk houses everywhere. with no thought and no planning going into the final part.
During the briefing times that they put the briefs together for the students, there's one thing that's happened all across this. They've pushed back on those briefs, completely pushed back on them and said, this is not Sydney, this is Newcastle, and we need solutions for Newcastle. It's been absolutely mind-blowing. Some of Jason's only one over that have come up with solutions for flooding, contamination. They've come up with solutions for the entire city. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to get into government to actually listen to us to what we're doing. We are such a different space and a different place to wherever Sydney will ever be. As John pointed out with the transport and that, we're such a different transport demographic.
Can you explain your role in all of this?
We have this actually come out of working with Dr. Bernie Curran. So Bernie had approached the university at the time before he passed away that we were going to do this forum, this area, and we were going to work with the students at the architecture department on coming up with solutions for Broadmeadow. It took 8 months from Bernie's passing for me to get everyone he had spoken to bring this together where we are today with John and Anne. We would never have got to this point where we're actually presenting this now. So we've been mentoring, if you like, just with the students and the architecture department. The 25 years of study that I've done on the site, that I had done on the site, and actually being on the site up until 2017, seeing the flooding issues, seeing the contamination issues that were on the site, gave us a great insight to pass on to students. So they have picked up all of that and come up with all solutions. So once you've got that sort of solution, then we worked with the Newcastle Museum to come up with the roundhouses being a museum space, the heritage buildings being reused. Then as we progressed, it became very evident that we had to keep green space in the middle. And this was students that kept coming up and saying, do we keep the green space? What do you think? So we all come, yes, we need this green space because of the amount of flooding. So when you see things like what Jason's done, you've actually got a complete solution of mitigation of that problem. I don't say it's perfect, it never will be, but it also included the environmental, and it also included the energy, what energy would be needed for the site, and how we could actually bring that carbon footprint right down.
But is anyone in power listening?
Well, I don't know.
I don't know. Look, see,
We
part
don't
of it's
know.
just letting us know about it. You
Well,
know,
Sonia Hornery did zoom in.
Yeah, Sonia, I've spoken, Paul and I have spoken to Sonia.
Yeah.
We'd also spoken to John some 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Carol Duncan came to a meeting with Bernie and us, and she actually talked about it.
Yeah.
And then the other day, Paul and I were invited to have a private interaction with the planning people before the main event. So are we being listened to? I don't know. We're now waiting for an invite for Tahu, who actually own the land, to actually talk to us about where this goes. The only way it's ever going to change is the Newcastle community needs to be able to see what we've seen today and actually take it to them and say, is this what you want?
Better. We want something better.
Want something better, because otherwise we're going to end up with Everleigh and Carriage Works in Sydney here. We're going to have a big space with nothing in it, and we would like this space to tell Newcastle and the Hunter region's story. And that's why we work with the museum and come up with the library and facilities.
Fantastic. And on that note, have we got any? We could go on talking for this, but I'd love to just thank our three presenters. Thank you very much, Joe, Jason, and John. Look, we'll make sure whatever announcement we've got to put on the
Hunter Living History site and join it. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in on this, and we'll try and make this recording available as soon as possible, because I think it's made me think. It's clarified a lot of things. terminology that we see bandied around. So just thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you very much, Joe, for giving us the historical where the wheels fell off and where they need to get back on, because we can't do anything without history. Thank you, John, for letting us just bringing all that sort of real world statistics in. I think, look, these to our future are really in our history, and we can make people actually excited about these plans by actually coming up with really wonderful solutions that we want to see built. Then, you know, there's a bit more hope in the world. Which Ollie needs.
Totally years.
Yeah. And we're going to demand it. You've got to say, look, stop giving us third-rate plans. And this is what they love dumping on us historically. So just
another sort of question. This information was 14 today. Is that going to go on the university website?
yes.
Because that, and then tell people about it. And if we can all say, you know, and have a look, some of the younger people will start to look. And they might start to ask questions at the right place.
And on that note, we'll end. And we'll see you next month for another history showcase on something which we'll decide what it's going to be about. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you later.